This video and channel is sponsored by Ratchet Clothing. Check out Ratchet's many styles. The link will be in the description. Okay, so in March of 2013, an incident took place at a strip club. But the story I'm about to tell is what transpired after that incident. So let's get started. In March of 2013, my friends and I had an altercation in a strip club called Gossip that's out in Long Island. At this time, the club was transitioning ownership. It previously was owned by the Lucchese family, specifically Neil Migliori. However, although he owned the club, he didn't own the property, and for some reason, he wasn't able to renew his lease. But the West Side, the Genovese family, had more success. So they purchased the club from Neil. One of the owners was a captain in their family by the name of Ralphie Bassamo. The night of the incident, Ralphie Bassamo got cracked in his face, and several of our friends were hurt as well. As a result of this, Joey DiBenedetto and myself was called to a sit-down at the Lucchese Social Club in the Bronx. Present that day was the administration, Big John, and an acting captain from the Bronx. We were told by Stevie Correa, the underboss at the time, that we were not allowed to retaliate. He also told us something interesting, and I'll get to that later. But this incident put the Lucchese family in a dilemma, and here's what it was. Anthony Guzzo and I were not yet members, we were associates at the time. Because of this incident, and more importantly, to protect us from any retribution, we were fast-tracked to being inducted, which took place 2 weeks later on April 2nd, 2013. The story I'm about to relay took place during the 2 weeks after the strip club incident and prior to us being inducted. Actually, it was days before the induction ceremony. It's important to note, at this time, our names were on a list that were being passed around for proposed members into the Lucchese crime family. Okay, now that we got that out of the way, Anthony Guzzo had gotten in touch with me and asked me to meet with him. And I believe I met him at his house in Staten Island that day. Back then, Anthony had been dealing narcotics with some guy from the Bronx. Remember, he wasn't inducted yet, so the no drug rule didn't apply to him. If he was caught dealing drugs, his name could have been removed from the proposed list. Or he could have received a warning to stop doing what he was doing. But the worst case scenario, he could have been chased from the family. None of the above happened because Anthony never got caught. So when I met with Anthony, he told me that this guy that he was dealing with in the Bronx offered him a good opportunity. He wanted to discuss it with me to see if I would get involved in it. Supposedly, the owner of the restaurant, Don Coquille, needed a favor. Don Coquille was located in the City Island section of the Bronx. According to what Anthony was told, the guy lent out $2 million and was unsuccessful in reclaiming his money. Allegedly, the restaurant owner was willing to give up 10% of the money if we could collect it. Anthony said we would split $100,000 each, so naturally I agreed to get involved. To be honest, at this time, the strip club incident wasn't even on my mind. We set a date for a few days later, and we would go take a ride to the Bronx and talk to the owner of the restaurant. When I left Anthony that day, I wanted to go do my homework on the owner of this restaurant. I went and spoke to a few people. One person in particular was Big John. I found out that the owner's name was Jimmy Rodriguez, and he owned several restaurants, including Jimmy's Bronx Cafe, Jimmy's Uptown, and Jimmy's Downtown. Big John had told me not long before we spoke, he had taken a girl out to lunch, I think in the Uptown restaurant. He said when he arrived at the restaurant, it wasn't open for lunch yet, but the owner happened to be there and let them sit down and order anyway. John said they made small talk with him and he was a nice guy. But I also found out that Jimmy Rodriguez had borrowed money in the past. When it comes to a sit down, whether it's one facing opposition or a friendly one, you should know who you're talking to, as well as any information available about them. After finding out everything I could, I wasn't happy with this information because a person who borrows money is rarely lending out $2 million. I'm not saying it's impossible, but highly unlikely. So for me, it was a red flag.
I found out later that he checked the assessment of the property, not the appraisal. The assessed for tax purposes is different from what appraised property. And it was assessed for $1 million or $1.5 million. So he pulled out of the deal. I said, Ruben, I don't have the money. I'll pay you when eventually I get into this deal. And, I remember like going to 100 black men and asking them for help. And they said, we can help you, but we can't help the whole village. We'll help you because we know who you are, and that's how we'll do it. And you always look up to these guys. And that was the beginning of Jimmy's. And then I did Jimmy's Downtown, Jimmy's Uptown, Jimmy City Island.
But I knew this information would come in handy when we did speak to this guy. On the day we were going to the Bronx, Anthony and I met at his cousin's house in Belmore, Long Island. We went over everything once again. I told him what I learned. And as usual, Anthony wanted to go in separate cars. And he wanted to use separate cars so that after we were done, he could go straight home from the Bronx. This was because his wife had him under a lot of pressure and he allowed her to question every hour that he was out. After we left Anthony's cousin's house and I got in my car and he got in his, as I was driving, I was starting to go over this whole thing in my head. Something wasn't sitting right with me. Something was off. And then it hit me. I called Anthony, who was in the car in front of me, and I asked him one question. I remember when Anthony first told me about his venture in the junk business, I had warned him to be careful. And he had told me that the guy he was dealing with was a good guy that was around people in the Bronx, which means he was an associate to one of the Bronx crews. So my question to Anthony was, did this guy from the Bronx just bring this opportunity up in conversation, or did he reach out to you about it? Anthony said that the guy called him and asked to meet with him, and then he told him about it. I shook my head. I told Anthony, pull the car over. I need to talk to you. Earlier, I mentioned when Anthony first discussed his opportunity with me, the strip club incident was the last thing on my mind. But at this moment, it was the only thing on my mind. We pulled our cars over, and I got out, and I asked Anthony another question. Why would a guy who's around people get the opportunity to make money and not bring that opportunity to those people? Yet, he wants to offer this opportunity to Anthony, a guy he's not associated with, and a guy who's not part of their crew. I asked him if it made any sense to him. He said, now that I think of it, it doesn't make any sense. Then I reminded him that just 2 weeks earlier, we were involved in an incident where a Genovese captain got cracked in his face. Now back to the sit down we had at the Lucchese Social Club. Stevie Korea told us that day that the Genovese family gave him a list of names of all the people that were involved in the incident. They had our names. I know who supplied our names, but that's another story that I'll get into at a later date. So I reminded Anthony that the Genovese family had all our names on a list. Then I told Anthony the most important piece of this puzzle. Ralphie Bassamo is from the Bronx, the same area where the guy who offered Anthony this money-making opportunity. An area where everyone calls each other their cousins, even if they're not related. Also, conveniently, the meeting location was at a restaurant located on City Island. For those of you not familiar with City Island, there is one way on and one way off that island. When I explained all this to Anthony and explained that this is the perfect setup, his face got a lot paler. I told him, if you still want to go, I'll go under one condition. We go get pistols. We agreed on that and we got back in our cars, but a few blocks later, Anthony pulled over again. I pulled my car behind him and got out of my car, and he said to me, you know, Nancy warned me about this same thing. Nancy was his wife. As soon as he said this, I knew it was a lie. He called Nancy as soon as he got in the car, and he told her what I just said, and she agreed with me. But he was giving his wife the credit. Ultimately, Anthony didn't even want to go anymore, even with pistols. He kept shaking his head and saying, I can't believe I didn't see this. This definitely had him spooked. I told him, if this guy from the Bronx calls you to ever want to meet with you, be very careful. But he said after this, he wasn't meeting with him no more. Before we went our separate ways that day, he turned to me and said something. He said, you know, Nancy's smart. She's my little consigliere. I just smiled, got in my car and left. But what I wanted to tell him was, no, Joe DiNapoli is your consigliere. Did I have proof that Ralphie Bassamo planned a sneak move? I didn't have any proof. Did I think that this is exactly what was involved? Absolutely. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please don't forget to like it. If you haven't subscribed yet, you could do that as well. By doing so, you'll receive a notification every time I post a new video. I want to thank everyone who has subscribed, and for those of you who participate in the community post polls. I think they're fun, especially when you get the answers wrong. Also, for the full story about the strip club incident, you can find it in my blog. I'll put a link down below in the description. You can subscribe to the Sit Down News blog at sitdownnews.com, and I appreciate everyone who has subscribed. Thank you. Well, just another example in the mob you never knew about. If you would like to subscribe to this channel, you could do so down below. If you would like to subscribe to my other channel, Unlimited Substance Podcast, I'll add a link in the description to this video.